All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in a few minutes here, just as we let people into the virtual room. I will say, please silence your cell phones, your computers, tablets, anything else that can ping or ding at me, because no one wants to hear that on C-SPAN. We'll get started in a few minutes here. Thank you. We're all ready? Good. I think mine should be on yet. Good. All right. Good. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this panel that we're having today. Thank you to everybody who's joining us virtually, and also who's joining us in person at the National League of Cities and NACO joint headquarters in Washington, D.C. And I should also say thank you to everybody who's joining us on C-SPAN. My name is Chris Thiel. I am the managing editor of Route 50. For those of you who haven't heard of Route 50, we are part of the GovExec Media Group. I cover state and local government technology, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So thank you very much for having me. I'm going to give very brief introductions for our panelists, and then we're going to get into the topic of the conversation. To my immediate left, I have Dr. James Bridges. He is the Director of Health and Human Services at Montgomery County, Maryland. Next to Dr. Bridges, we have Dr. Bill Doherty. He is a psychologist and the co-founder of Braver Angels, which is a group that looks to bridge the kind of divides that we have between us. He's going to tell us a lot more about that work later on. Moving down the line, we have Julian Novak. She is the CEO and Executive Director of the International City County Management Association. Right on the end there, we have Steve Patterson. He is the Mayor of Athens, Ohio, and President of the National League of Cities. And then beaming into us virtually, a little bit like he's on the International Space Station, is Matt Leninger. He directs the Center for Democracy Innovation at the National Civic League. And may I first say thank you to everybody for joining me on stage today. So our conversation is about addressing the rise of incivility. What happened? Where did it kind of go wrong? And how can we move things in a more, shall we say, civil direction? And I'd like to start with what may sound like a basic question, but I'm hoping is going to lay the groundwork here. And Julia, I'd like to come with you. You're going to bat lead off today. How would you define civility? What does that make you think of?
There's three things that I would say. The first, and I go to the dictionary. What's the definition? And so there's in the Institute for Civility in Government defines it as claiming and caring for one's identity, needs, and beliefs without degrading someone else in the process. And if you just go to the American Heritage Dictionary, I love the second definition that's there, which is because it links the need for civility to be based in respect, that we have respect for one another. And they say by respect, we don't mean deference to authority or position, but rather we're referring to the American principle of avoiding the violation of an individual's fundamental rights. And I would say, lastly, I think for the communities that we serve, civility is in part a decision. It decides about how you are going to choose to represent your community, what you will allow in your civic square as you debate and discuss issues of importance to your communities.
And Bill, I'd like to come to you next.
Yeah, that's a great way to kick it off. And what I would add is that civility is respect for somebody's dignity. And we know it when we don't see it. And that is attacks on motives, attacks on character, attacks on basic competence. And I always like to think about this, the golden rule, to treat others, even when I disagree with them, as I would like to be treated.
And Matt joining us from Zoom land, please feel free to pitch in.
Sure. I mean, things that communities all have to be able to do in governance is to be able to make decisions together, solve problems together, and to build community. And so civility is an important prerequisite for any of those things. It has this kind of tremendous instrumental need and definition, as well as being kind of a quality of our character.
Yeah. Well, what I should say as well before we really get into this is that we are going to be taking questions from the audience via the Zoom, if you're kind of beaming in virtually like Matt is, or if you're in the room as well, we're going to have a microphone that we're going to pass around at a specific time. And we actually already have a follow-up question from the audience that was kind of pre-submitted. And I'm going to read it, and then I'm hoping that someone will pitch in. Some say there might even be disagreement nowadays about what constitutes an uncivilized action. Is there value in setting out ground rules or having conversations about definitions of an uncivilized action? And I'd look to any of my panelists. Yeah.
Sure, Chris. I'll jump in since I am batting cleanup. So I just want to add a little bit to the definition of incivility, but it's also understanding cultural competencies and being a bit humble, I would say. And so along those lines, I think education and training would empower folks to understand the importance of civility and how that impacts many communities and many services across the broad spectrum. There are a lot of challenges right now in the space in which I work in health and human services, but there's a bit of unrest and incivility. And so more empowerment comes through open dialogue. I actually have a sign in my office that says, or that reads, I should say, choose civility. So understanding what that means by any reference or definition. And when folks aren't aligned with your definition of civility, it's incumbent upon us as leaders to align those thoughts around what civility means.
Right. Well, does anyone else want to pitch in on that? Maybe Mayor Patterson, since we haven't heard from you yet.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit more to it. You know, when you're talking about civility, you're creating a positive, inclusive environment. You know, that's what civics is. That's what civil societies are. But to also kind of mention that what we're seeing and experiencing out there, especially as an elected official, is it's okay to disagree, you know, as long as you're disagreeing in a civil manner, as opposed to being disagreeable, you know, which is counter to that, because to be that is you want to be divisive. You want to sit there and create controversy as opposed to coming together to come up with a reasonable solution, which has compromise back and forth. But again, you know, to have a disagreement, to disagree is okay, but to be disagreeable is where you're taking things in a direction that I think tends to lead to a lot of what we're experiencing across the nation.
And Chris, I would just say, I do think ground rules and kind of setting expectations, especially in the public forum, is a really important tool to help people know what you expect of them, what you expect of your colleagues, if you're part of a governing body or an organization. And one of the things that I encourage people to think about is that often cheering and jeering are the same things. You know, if you allow an environment where people can cheer, you create some intimidation, because then what if they don't agree with me? And so ground rules, and we think, oh, cheering is supportive and we want to encourage support. But it could also, if I disagree with the statement being made, it might create an environment where I'm uncomfortable saying what I need to be said, what needs to be said from my perspective. So leveling the playing field by setting expectations and making sure folks are participating listening in a quiet manner and participating with respect to the people they're engaging with, I think is an important part of civility.
This idea of cheering and jeering speaks very deeply to me as a soccer fan, and I do wonder if basketball would be better if we banned all that. But
the horns.
Yeah, maybe. Dr. Bridges, I want to come back to you for this next one. Yourself and Mayor Patterson are very public facing individuals. You know, he is a mayor, as I've said, you're a public health official, kind of out there with the public every day. Why is civility important, particularly for someone in your role? And then maybe the flip side of that, why is incivility a problem, particularly in the work that you do?
Great question, Chris. And I want to thank Steve for all his work that he does as a city official, because there's a partnership not only with the municipalities and the officials that manage them, but also with the agencies that are within those municipalities. We often face a lot of incivilities because folks just don't know. And just helping them work through whatever challenges, life challenges they may have. So it takes a little bit of that education and follow up and training with staff, because they're often the front facing staff. They are the face of the agencies. They often bear the brunt of all of that incivility and disrespect, and to some extent, hate. So part of that process is managing their behavior as well, not to be in a retaliatory manner, because when they're often faced with adversity, then they have a tendency to be uncivil.
And Mayor Patterson, from your perspective, leading a city.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is interesting, you know, for me being a full-time mayor, strong mayor in the city of Athens, and what you just mentioned with your frontline staff, you know, they're, you know, taking the brunt of a lot of the hostility that comes, whether it's your swimming pool, you know, isn't warm enough or cold enough or whatever. And, you know, it's a whole sundry of different things that we end up managing. But one of the things I'm just constantly saying during my Monday morning meetings with all staff is, you know, we just need to remain disciplined. We need to remain positive. We need to make sure that we are emulating the behavior that we would like to see returned to us from the community, and being consistent about it. You know, it's hard to do. But, you know, my lived experience, you know, being a professor for 18 years of my life and being, you know, retired military member, you know, it's kind of like bundling all those skill sets together to maintain that level of diplomacy and negotiating and coming up with a positive solution at the end of the day. But I guess that my end point being with this is that it's really important for civic leaders to always just be consistent and be disciplined in your messaging forward, and taking the information in from an individual, but reflecting back not their behavior, but reflecting a more positive behavior in return.
I'd like to add something to that. I'm glad we talked about the frontline folks, right? My wife was a long-term nurse, and people would be obnoxious to the schedulers and the nurses. And then the doctor walks in, "Oh, Dr. So-and-so, nice to see you." And so one of the things that, and I realize we're into solutions now, is actual training for frontline staff on the most common scenarios. We at Brave Angels, we've done this with interns in Congress who answer the phones. We discovered that there are about 7 predictable, repeated, difficult calls. It's not infinite, right? And then with them, we developed skills, tools that they can practice, which is then on the ground. It's like developing the competency. You talked about intercultural competency. Develop the competency to deal with upset constituents, community members. And it's sort of like, I got this. I know what to do. Not just I should, but here's what I can say.
Just to add, it's a shared experience, because once you train the staff, then as staff are onboarded, part of that onboarding process, they get a chance to understand, and it's a conditioned response, being a trained psychologist like you are. So you understand some of the nuances of behavior modification. But if they don't practice it, and if it's not reinforced, then they will emulate that same behavior when they are faced with a challenge.
I would just add, you know, you think about, well, what difference does it make? When there is that much energy and incivility around a topic, people who don't know much about the topic at hand think, huh, they must be really screwing up. There's some underlying acceptance that there must be something wrong. And when people believe that, it actually erodes trust in government. And so trust is something that is important to build, and it increases public participation, it increases engagement in your communities. And so when you allow this negative discourse to be the brand of your community publicly, you're actually contributing to a declining rate of trust in people's perception in your local government.
And if I could jump in, Chris, I think
Yeah, of course, Matt,
kind of, there's three elements here. Part is the conduct, the moral part of it. What conduct do we expect from our officials, from our staff, from our presidents, and how do you reinforce and support good conduct? There's a skills part that two of you were already talking to. That's important. And there's also the settings part. And the settings that we have for government and citizens to interact, those generally do not encourage civility. And in many ways, they actually encourage incivility. And so one thing we really have to understand is how we change those, and how do they get to where they are, and how do we kind of update them so that they encourage all the different sorts of things we want to have happening in public life.
Now, Matt, I want to actually stay with you for the next question, which is a bit of a strange one for those of us who follow our history, asking how we got here. It seems as though our communities are more fractured than ever. Public engagement, as I'm sure all of our panelists have seen, can kind of turn into unproductive shouting and yelling and people being very angry. But then I think of President Clinton, who was just at Oklahoma City last week talking about, incivility around the tragic events there 30 years ago. And I'm trying to figure out how this crisis developed. Has it always been there and it's just we're more aware of it now? Matt, talk to me, give us some historical context to kind of kick us off.
Sure. So there's three things. One is, like I was saying, that the typical formats for citizens and government to interact were basically developed around 50 to 100 years ago. And they weren't created for civility or really that much in terms of public participation. They were created for transparency. They were trying to make sure that people had a chance to see the decisions that were being made so that they weren't corrupt. They were kind of following the will of the community. And so most of these meetings and other sorts of things were created in order to kind of enforce transparency using the technologies of the day, the typewriter, the microphone, those sorts of things, the photocopier later on. So we have better ways of ensuring transparency today. Second thing is, against this backdrop of kind of old-fashioned meetings, you have changed people. The people of today are simply different from their predecessors of a generation ago or 2 generations ago. People are phenomenally more educated, more literate. They're less deferential to authority of all kinds, and they have the internet. So they're different citizens that we're trying to incorporate and trying to have participate in governance. And then the third thing is simply this rise in polarization over the last few years, which is kind of documented in all kinds of ways. But now you have people who are actively trying to organize to disrupt various sorts of public meetings, and these very old-fashioned meeting formats are designed to be easy to hijack. They encourage incivility and frustration, and so they are the worst possible settings in which we can deal with polarization or any of these difficult public issues that we face.
Bill, I'd love to come to you. I mean, you obviously study human beings, job. Have people's brains changed over the years?
No, I'm glad you asked that. No, our circumstances have changed. So it's very clear that there's been a rise in polarization over the last 40 years. Historians are saying it's as bad now as it was just before the Civil War. And this is about the people who differ from us about important issues, political and others, that we think of them as strangers, as alien, like, who are you if you disagree with me? We don't like them as much. And so we just actively more dislike people who disagree. And then the third category that social scientists talk about is we see them as morally bankrupt. So I don't understand you, I don't like you, and you're a bad person. That's quite a combination. And those are the characteristics of this rise in polarization. And so this is the air we're breathing, combined with lower social trust, there's been a precipitous decline in social trust in all of our institutions and in one another since the 1970s. So low trust, high polarization, and then you get the pandemic, you get all of this stuff, and then as Matt said, yet we have these terrible formats. Whoa, we really got. I want to do one little. I always like to do one little piece. I'm a family therapist. In 1960, only 5% of Americans said they would be uncomfortable with a son or daughter marrying somebody of the other party. 5%. Now it's 40 to 45%. Okay. Interracial attitudes towards interracial marriage is going the other direction. Okay. So it's not that we become less tolerant in general, but we do not tolerate these political differences. And this is invading, it's invading the local government. People are, Tip O'Neill used to say all politics are local. I think that now what's happening is national politics goes local. So if you disagree with me about almost anything, I ask, are you a liberal, conservative? And then I brand you.
And I think I'd just like to add to what Matt and Bill are saying to enhance not only the polarization, but think about the technology. As I sit and I listen to my colleagues joining us this afternoon, first thing I thought about was maybe over 35 years ago when we had what was then called the World Wide Web, and it was a dial-up, and folks didn't have social media, and folks could not like or unlike you. So from a social science research base, family therapist base, you talked more. You don't talk now. You don't have those interpersonal skills. And so in some ways you become combative through social media, through other platforms, where you really don't get a chance to practice civility. You teeter back and forth between the realm of civility and incivility. And that's what I've experienced over these last 5 years, especially coming out of COVID.
Matt, I'd love to come to you. And is that something that you're seeing in the last 5 years? Did COVID break us in a way?
I do. And I agree with everything that's being said up here. I think the technologies that have so rapidly changed the way we communicate, the way we consume information and news these days has led to this. But what I reflect on, I became mayor in Athens in 2016. And I remember during the pandemic, when the pandemic March, everything shut down and the pandemic, smacked us in the face and we're all trying to manage that. It was really interesting to see how many elected officials in 2020 and into 2021 basically threw their hands up and said, I'm not built for this. And I don't think it was necessarily the managing the pandemic. I think a lot of this came out of the Frontlines report that the National League of Cities produced, which was a survey that went out to kind of find out when it comes to negative interactions that you're having in your communities, what is that looking like? What we surveyed to see what NLC members were experiencing, and 81% had indicated that they had experienced violence, hostility, or violence. Violence was something that they were, saying that they were experiencing for sure, and harassment. And with those, in looking at it even more deeply, the data was showing that we were losing elected officials in our communities. These are people who, basically, when you think about it, you're putting yourself out there to be a public servant. This is something that you're the one who went on the ballot. You're the one who said, I want to run. I want to sit there and for the better of my community. And now to start to see the loss of those, and in particular, elected women officials and persons of color, we started saying, this is not for me, which is really, if you think about it, at the end of the day, so destructive for so many communities, because who's going to step up now to run for those positions? And that's becoming a challenge within communities, is who is raising their hand to say, I'll run for office, public office, whether it's a city council member, a mayor, a treasurer, or an auditor. This is all levels of elected officials, your law directors. A lot of them are saying, yeah, is this worth it? And I would contend and say this over and over again. Yes, it is worth it, but that's a hard message to deliver, when we're seeing this data that's happening. But we are seeing some breakthrough too. we're seeing some real positives in communities where they are figuring out how to bring together the community for consensus on projects, on comprehensive plans, on a number of different things. I'll give one quick example, if I may, and that is that in Bellevue, Washington, where in a 20-year span of time went from a majority white community to a minority majority community, and they were able to work together to create a new space for immigrants and refugees to come together, and it's working in Bellevue. But it takes a lot of work to make that type of change, and that's a pretty rapid shift for a 20-year period of time to see that transition. But again, that's one of many, many examples that are out there for communities that they are figuring out how to continue to work effectively, transparency, being open about what it is, the processes that you're working through, and it works, but it takes a lot of work. Hard things are hard.
I just would love the comments about kind of the impact that some of the incivility is having, and kind of a little bit of a data nerd. There's actually a threats and harassment dashboard that Princeton University maintains, and the data absolutely supports what he's saying. So just to give some level of magnitude, like, well, so what? So yeah, some people are discouraged. 75% of local elected officials report a reduced willingness to run for re-election because of posts on social media, threats of harassment. And to your point, young officials report higher rates of hostility towards them. Women report facing significantly higher rates of hostility and worry, and a decreased willingness to engage in political activities. And the same is true for minorities. And so we end up, by allowing this culture of incivility to take over the public square, we are decreasing public participation in the democratic process.
Well, now that we've kind of laid out the problems that we're facing and the issues, a lot of our audience, whether they're in the room or they're virtual, they want to know how they can address the issue in their own communities. They want to know what they can do. We've already received dozens of questions, and that was the big theme. How do we support community engagement, build that respectful and open atmosphere that we all want, so that we can have good civic engagement and discourse? And I'd like to come to each of you individually, and I want to talk about some of the work that you've been doing to reduce incivility, promote healthy public discourse and engagement. And Bill, I'd like to come to you first. What are some of the kind of strategies that you've seen be effective in terms of relationship building based on your work with Braver Angels? And feel free to tell us all about the organization as well, so people have some good context.
Sure. We've been doing workshops we call Managing Difficult Conversations with Constituents. And in Minnesota and some other places like North Carolina. But in Minnesota, we've had hundreds of local elected officials and managers take this workshop. So part of it is that we need new skills for a new era. Abraham Lincoln said, we're in new times, we must rise to the times. Okay. And so things have to happen at broad levels, but at the specific level is upgrading skills. It's like we've been doing workshops for physicians and nurses in an era of low social trust. Well, you can't assume everybody's going to trust you anymore. So what are the skills? And there are identifiable skills. So I would encourage people, and I'll just give an example. If you and I disagree, you disagree with me, the first thing is to connect with you before I disagree back. Okay. Like it's standard, not just correct your facts, but to say, I hear your concerns. Okay. And then here's where I'm with you. And that's an example of a basic skill we know that de-escalates people. And so in an era of escalation, just as we try to train our police officers in de-escalation, I think we need to train our elected officials at the local level, our managers and others, in some of those basic skills. And that's part of what we do with Braver Angels, is with regular folks and with also elected officials. What are the skills for living in a democracy where people are agitated?
On that point with the de-escalation skills for local elected officials, not to besmirch all of you, Matt Patterson, but some might see escalation as a good thing, perhaps. They like the political rough and tumble, shall we say. How do you kind of alter that mindset?
I kind of mentioned this on the front end. So much of it is just being consistent with my own behavior, with my own responses, with my body language when I'm communicating. I'll give one example that was really pretty fascinating in Athens. Athens is the home to Ohio University, which makes up the lion's share of our population in reality. And so with that, we've got this ever-changing, ever-evolving student body that comes in where their experience with purchasing, with where they go to dine, with all these different things, it constantly changes. And so if you think about that and the changes in your own local economy, and if you don't have businesses that are keeping up, you can find that they're going to be behind the power curve and possibly fold. And so we've had a number of small businesses close in Athens over the past year and a half. We've also had a large number of small businesses come in to fill that void. But for those that were lost, it was interesting. It ended up becoming the city government's fault. The city government is doing something wrong that is causing this for these businesses to leave. And so we had a town hall meeting, which was orchestrated by some small business leaders, some of whom were still had their businesses going, some who were on the verge of closing, again, because of just the buying patterns of individuals, of the student body and whatnot. And so I wasn't necessarily invited, but I went. I thought it was important that I go. There was 6 of the 7 city council members also went. And not only did we go, but as the meeting went on, I was asked we need to hear from the mayor. Mayor, what are you doing about this? And so I stood up and I was very conscious about how I was presenting myself, my own body language, and just basically talking through what I just told all of you, that there's economic pressures that are out there that have nothing to do with your own government and what's going on with your small businesses. But by doing that and standing there and I'll tell you, I took some barbs on that particular meeting, but that's okay, because for me to sit there and continue to present as I'm listening, this is an issue which I understand is a problem. There's solutions, and I've got 6 solutions. Help me with other solutions you may have. So I purposely am trying to draw everyone in to come up with solutions. Don't just come to me with problems, come with solutions as well, because collectively we can figure this out.
Matt, I'd like to bring you in. The mayor mentioned, town halls and meetings, and you've talked a lot about how board meetings and such aren't really structured to get input that people want to be able to give. And they're outdated a little bit. What are some examples of how to kind of create spaces, different kinds of spaces, so that people feel their voices are being better heard?
Sure. And let me first mention, as a kind of way to reassure us all, that the National Civic League, my organization, was actually founded at a time when democracy was in trouble, when trust was low and polarization was high. It was founded in 1894. So we, periodically, as Bill mentioned, we've gone through this in our history, and we've emerged in various ways over time, and we'll do that again. One of the things that we have now is this at the Civic League is the center that I run, which is called the Center for Democracy Innovation. And over the last couple of years, we've had this thing called the Better Public Meetings Project, where we've worked with cities around the country to change the way they do their official public meetings, official school board meetings as well. So some of the things that we can do here are things that are outside those official meetings. There's all kinds of, and the mayor already mentioned several of them, all kinds of ways you can interact with the public in good, deliberative, participatory kinds of ways. And you can also change those meetings themselves. And some of the same sorts of things work in both spaces. First of all, small group discussion and deliberation. The things that Bill was mentioning a minute ago, those skills are best practiced, in some cases only can be practiced when you're at a table with a group of about 6 to 8 people, right? They can't be done when half the group is down on the kind of in uncomfortable chairs milling around, and the other half is up behind the dais. So kind of changing the room, changing the formats of the room to enable some of those skills to be practiced are important. And then there's all kinds of digital things you can do both inside and outside the room, which get people reacting to things, get them answering polling questions, getting some of their comments up where they can see them. There's all kinds of ways that are productive ways that make people feel like they can be heard. And instituting some of those sorts of things instead of the 3 minutes on a microphone sort of public comment period that most cities have today, that's essential. As long as you have the 3 minutes at the microphone sort of thing, you're limiting the amount of discussion, the amount of participation you could have. You're preventing people who might otherwise come to your meetings from coming because they know that's part of it. They don't want to be there. And you're creating an atmosphere where some people can basically hijack the meeting, prevent the elected body from doing what it's there to do. And so changing some of this so that you're taking out some of the older, more updated pieces and adding in some things that are more deliberative, more equitable, or participatory is the only way to kind of move forward.
Does anyone else want to chime in on anything Matt said? Yeah, Julian.
Well, I mean, the tools piece is like where the rubber meets the road. Like, how can we practically do something about this? I've been with ICMA for about 60 days. And in my prior life, I worked with lots of elected officials and their professional staff in trying to work through, like, how do we behave civilly? How do we encourage the public to behave civilly? And some of my former colleagues and I had worked on a Saving Democracy training where we would bring, cities and counties, elected bodies together to talk about the things you can do to create an improved atmosphere in the public square. And so we've placed some checklists and tools for good governance that my former colleagues have put together on the ICMA website under civility. If you look for those things, there's tools and checklists, and there's a role for the elected official, for the professional staff, for the governing body, and then for the public themselves and the anchor institutions that we engage with. And so it's just important, I think, to kind of take some access to some of those tools and do the things you can do to fix it where you are. The only way we fix it nationally is one community at a time.
And Dr. Bridges, I'd like to come to you first. I mean, I'm sure you've seen all sorts of civil and uncivil behavior up close, and I'm sure you have all sorts of stories to tell, but is there anything that you've seen work particularly well to address that kind of incivility when it comes to the kind of public health space?
Sure, Chris, thank you for that question. And we don't have enough time for me to go through all the stories that I have.
Oh, we'll make time, don't you worry.
But at a local level, I think is some of what my colleagues have been saying as far as using the tools and the resources. Part of that is stakeholder engagement, internal and external stakeholder engagement, working with our executive branch and our legislative branch to really discuss and have an open and candid conversation about incivility in our space in public health. Many of our professionals really don't understand incivility in a sense or what it means because they are often the brunt of all of the incivility in the community. But looking at policies that are crafted to support the workplace and those individuals in the workplace, especially, I'm gonna go back to the frontline staff because I think that's where we see or have the crux of our challenges with our frontline staff. They're the ones who meet the public. They're the ones who are with individuals as they receive their clinical treatment. But one other piece I want to add is that thinking about the leadership and the staff away from the front line, often we've worked together to look at creative strategies that would not only increase an understanding of civility or incivility, if you will, but also to look at those mental health challenges that may, in fact, they experience at that level. We really don't talk about the mental health challenges that they have. And so we really need to address some of those mental health challenges that they have because they go through the rigors of this day in and day out. I've heard that this is a thankless position. Folks don't come to them with a sense of gratitude, more so why they don't have or why I'm not receiving. And some folks, quite frankly, internalize some of that and they respond in a hint of incivility. So I think that's what I've experienced. And we saw a lot of this in COVID, and I won't really go into a lot of that detail, but I think from my experience, I've seen more incivility over the past 6 years than I've seen over 35 years in the public health space.
Anyone else want to chime in on anything they've heard? Yeah, Bill.
Just one other thing, and that is, I think it would be good to engage community conversations wider about what kind of community do we want here. Not blaming individuals, but the faith communities, the other communities, the nonprofits, like owning it as a we problem. Okay, because a lot of times people who are uncivil say it's the government's problem, right? And then it's tempting to say, well, no, it's that personality and they're negative people. It's a we problem. And the way we change norms usually is not just through professional behavior, like the big decline in teenage pregnancies in this country. Now, what we've done as professionals has helped, but a lot of it is that kids started to say, no, this isn't a good idea. Okay, instead of congratulating their friend, like, oh man, that's not too smart. So how can we have community-wide conversations about how we would like to deal with each other when we disagree in this community? And there, I think there would be a lot of common ground. There'd be a lot of common ground.
Yeah, people
now-
tend to,
Yes, go ahead, Matt. Sorry, yeah.
just adding to, people tend to abide by rules that they help set. So that's as Bill was saying, that's a time-honored practice in public discussion, public deliberations, is giving people a chance to say, how do we want to act toward each other? And they make those ground rules themselves, or they at least look at a sample list and they say, yeah, we like those, or I'm going to add another one. Give people a chance to say how they want to behave. And that's so much more effective than trying to tell them from the beginning, you need to behave this way. That is, and if you can build that into all of the kind of ways you're interacting with people, and you can do it on an annual basis as part of a big, summit meeting or some, plan for public engagement, and you can do it meeting by meeting, discussion by discussion, give people a chance to kind of set the terms. And use one more thing, Robert's rules are not good for this. Robert's rules were not designed for civility. They were designed for efficient decision-making by an elected body. If you want to talk to the public, use Bob's rules. Google them. It's a kind of a version of Robert's rules, which is actually designed for civility, that's actually embodying the things that Bill just said about how do you help people in a group.
Civility summits.
There you go.
Annual gathering. How do we want to deal with one another? And what are the norms? I guarantee you, if you ask that question, the norms that come forward would be ones we like.
And Matt, the only thing I would add is that with Robert's Rules of Order, you can't slam the gavel down to silence someone, because they will continuously talk, because that's the space that they're in, and you just have to be an active listener in that space.
Mayor Patterson, it's taken me all this time and I haven't made a joke about you being Athens and having a big, shoes to fill for, the ancient Greeks and the way they used to do public engagement. But
Too bad you didn't.
Yeah,
anyway,
the bedrock
we finally
of,
got to it.
yeah, we finally got there. But I mean,
democracy.
yeah, exactly. I mean, how do you do it in Athens on the kind of local level? And is much of what you're hearing speaking to you about what you do?
No, a lot does speak to me. I think there has to be, on this topic of just division that occurs with divisive conversations, with incivility, is having a summit, a civility summit, and we're come together and kind of reframe the ground rules. I don't want to say rules, just the way in which we treat each other. Because at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We all basically want the same things, but that's a tall order, So I look at the city of Athens, and our population is just under 30,000, and then I have to mentally think, okay, now scale. Let's take that to Chattanooga. Let's take that to Austin, Texas. Let's take it to Los Angeles or New York. And how do you do something like that? And I would say that it ends up becoming, again, smaller neighborhood by neighborhood, and work it that way. But in the city of Athens, this really speaks to me, because I'm going to take something home and start to noodle on this a little bit more, because we are a college town, which I think, to me, we're the consummate college town. Athens was established in 1797 and Ohio University 1804. So we've literally grown up together. And that, I think, affords a real opportunity to have these more open, rich dialogues as to how do we effectively engage with each other. And again, I'm going to go back to, we can agree to disagree, but just stop being disagreeable.
We're going to turn now to some audience questions, and if you're in the Zoom, please feel free to send them in. We've got someone on our end who's monitoring. And we're gonna, I think, also probably pass a microphone around as well, for some in the room questions as well. But we've got sent one, and it's an absolute belter, and I wanted to make sure we answered
What was
it.
that
all nervous
English
now.
word?
Sir,
What was that?
sir.
Bowser, is that a form of dog?
Yeah. Anyway, we talk about the decline in civic engagement, social capital. There's just less chances, less opportunities for us to get to know our neighbors, to get to know them in places other than the workplace. And I want to go down the line, and I want to start with Dr. Bridges and maybe ask all of you for your thoughts. How do we make connections with our neighbors and with our community members when all of these other avenues seem to be closing, perhaps?
So great question from the audience. I think one approach is to keep it open and in a sense of making it accessible. We often want folks to come to us. We need to be able to go to them and extend an outreach approach to have those conversations. Some folks, because of societal norms now, aren't engaging. They may or may not lack those interpersonal skills. So first, we must be inviting. Secondly, again, to be open, and then to be able to understand their challenges, if any challenges. And lastly, accept those challenges that we have ourselves. And looking at incivility or how we define it or interpret it or expect someone else should understand in a shared environment, I think that would be one approach.
Bill, I want to go to you now.
Well, it's a big question, because the decline in civic life and civic participation is at the root of what we're talking about here. So in addition, I would add, it goes back to the summit idea. What about government as a convener of conversation sometimes without a direct endpoint, but just we're dealing with this challenge. Let's harvest people's views on it in one of the processes that Matt talks about. So people experience coming together and talking about a common problem in a constructive way.
I think if people do seek out community, they don't necessarily seek community in the public square, though. And so while government absolutely has an important role to play in convening, it can also play an important role by choosing to engage where people are already engaging in their communities, be that a faith community, a nonprofit, a service center, but by actually kind of flipping the paradigm and saying, we need to go where people are looking for community, and then how can we be supportive of that?
I think the one thing that I would add to this is, so often the government is in your city hall, your village hall, your town hall. So the public is coming to that same facility all the time, and flip that script and be meaningful and having it in other areas in your community so that you are truly accessible to where, and then being cognizant of the time in which your meetings are taking place. We just built a new fire station headquarters, and one of the thoughts that popped into my head when this was being built, and it's got a great conference room and it's a large space, is we should be having on occasion City Hall there. The other thing that we do in Athens, which I really enjoy, is that we, I think one of the safest and most productive spaces or events for people, this is for everybody, is over a meal. There are several things that we do in the city of Athens. We have basically a welcoming meal every fall for anybody who's new to the community and people who have been in the community for a long time, and the electeds come as well. And we break bread together and start that conversation and have that just kind of organically, freely flow. We have another event in Athens, which is really pretty interesting. Our main street is called Court Street. And Court Street, in the summer months, we have a table that is the entire length of a city block, and it brings people together for a meal. There's a cost, but brings people together for a meal, and it's really interesting to sit there and watch and observe the conversations that take place there. But that's a more difficult one to do. But again, to take your city, town, village hall meetings on the road, get out in the neighborhoods, get out somewhere outside of the fixed bricks and mortar city hall and have meetings that are business outside of your traditional city hall or council chambers.
Matt, I'm sorry to make you go last on this one, but I do want to make sure we hear from you on this question.
Sure. No, then these are all terrific ideas, and there's some great examples to look at. There's things like budgets and beer, which some cities have done, like Arlington, Virginia, where they have discussions about budgets and things like that at restaurants and bars in the community. There's things that invite are good for young families, where kids can be involved. Decatur, Georgia has done things like Touch the Budget, Touch a Truck, where they bring kind of their fire trucks and police vehicles and vehicles to the town square, and you get your kid's picture taken behind the wheel, and that meanwhile they're talking with you about the cost of materials and how the different aspects of the budget. There's also, we should be thinking about going where people are digitally as well. And so the fact that so many households in America are connected to some sort of local online network, such as Nextdoor or a Facebook group page, that is a whole frontier for local governments that I think most governments haven't figured out how to kind of really interact with people in those sorts of settings. But that's another place where they are. And it's a place where you can get to them in a way that can be meaningful and interactive. Then when you want to bring them to you, when you want them to come to town halls or the official public meetings, there are some great ways to invite them. They're different from the normal sorts of things. One is civic lottery, basically randomly selecting people to participate in some sort of forum on a public issue. That's something that the city of Boulder has done as part of the Better Public Meetings project I mentioned, where they've got a city community forum where some of the participants have been selected by lottery to weigh in on an issue like economic development. Another way to do this is to bring young people to those meetings. And so Mesa, Arizona, the school board there has used youth leadership through a project called Hacktivate, and also a digital tool that they use, but basically to bring young people's voices and ideas to public meetings and actually bring the young people themselves to talk about what some of these issues that are important to schools. All of that work has been supported by the AAA ICDR Foundation, which has enabled us to work with those places. But there's a lot of great examples that you can kind of look and see what might be useful to you because you're working in a similar community where you've got similar sorts of challenges.
We've had several questions all related to social media. And Matt, since you brought up social media, I'm going to come to you first with this. Obviously, we've had actually quite a few questions about the role that these accounts, so some social media accounts play in contributing to incivility, misinformation, whether that's fake profiles or bots run by various malignant actors. And then there's also, I guess on the flip side of that, officials need to kind of navigate some of these regulatory barriers. Maybe they don't feel able to address misinformation coming from social media because they feel that their hands are tied by various local laws. Matt, there's a question in here somewhere, but I guess how do you navigate this new, environment of social media and do so within the bounds of regulation?
Well, I think wherever it occurs, it's generally important to respond, give people the real story of whatever is going on, and give them the link to look at the report or the article in the newspaper or whatever that's going to be helpful to them. But more than that, seek out the settings where you can actually get people talking about the information, because people generally, they only kind of absorb information collectively. That's what allows them to actually analyze it, figure out, well, what is the source for this? Do we really trust this? What are they actually saying here? And so whether those are in online, the kind of the local online networks are better for that, because these are settings where people are not anonymous, where they're neighbors, they know each other. And so there's a bit more of a kind of built-in kind of desire for people to actually interact productively and not be uncivil. So in those sorts of online settings, then of course in-person settings where you can give people time in small groups to talk about some key thing or some piece of information and figure out what is fact and what's fiction and what does it actually mean to them and how they're going to use that in their decision making.
Anyone else want to weigh in about the perils of social media? Yeah, Julia.
Very seldom do I hear someone talk about how Nextdoor has really helped the tone of input in their communities. But just last week, one of the things that we do as a professional association is we connect people's good ideas with each other. We're not the author of them, but we help people see what's happening in other communities, connect them, and the scalability. Does it work here? Does it work there? That's very important. Last week in our knowledge network, there was an exchange about, how do you diffuse rumors? And there was some incredible creativity that's happening in local communities. Is it true spaces on the website? Someone whose job it is to monitor the rumors on Nextdoor and say, here's the facts. And those types of tools are really important. I'd also just acknowledge, especially in the current climate of fiscal resources being constrained again, it's an investment, and it's an investment that it's hard sometimes to make in a community, to have someone dedicated to really, we have to have someone that just put the truth out there and stop the rumors. And yet, if you don't, it contributes to a decline in engagement. And if we need people in a democracy to be engaged in their communities, then we have to help set the record straight as well.
I would agree. I would just add that from our agency standpoint, we have a public information officer where we try to centralize the messaging so that we're all talking in one voice. And it is a challenge to stay ahead of it, just to make sure that, because even if there's a letter, a syllable, or character missing from that thread, it could go sideways, as they say. And so one of the things that we try to do is remain transparent and provide that information that we have, that we know is factual, either research based or scientific in nature, or just as a response to manage some of the incivility that could come out of this. And so I think through social engagement, we need to remain transparent, speak to those things that we can, and not talk to those things that we can't.
I'll talk over your colleague.
That's
here.
all right. That's all right.
Sorry.
We're going to be
Trustee,
civil.
You
here.
need
We're
to
gonna
let
be
me know
civil
when
here.
you're done.
We're going to be civil.
Where was I? There we go. Just really briefly, at a Brave Angels micro skill here, that you're asking me, like, what happened to this person in the city got fired, right? And so instead of just saying, well, the laws prevent me from revealing that, to say, I know this is frustrating because you cared about that person and you're wondering what the heck's going on. I wish I could tell you. And we got these rules to protect people and I can't. As opposed to just, here's the facts, here's the law. Connect first. If I'm frustrating you by saying I can't do that, acknowledge I'm frustrated.
Another question from the audience, and we kind of alluded to this already, but I'd love to just dig in a little bit more. How do gender and race impact the way incivility is portrayed? The question continues. I promise this is the question and not me. As a woman, I find the level of civility to drop when people speak to me versus my male colleagues. Does anyone want to take a first hack at that?
Sure. Reluctantly. I think we need to be aware. I think understanding gender differences and having a respect of self and others. I think for me, I am literally in the minority as a senior leader, director of an agency. I have 13 female senior leaders. And I have to govern myself accordingly to understand not only that collegial respect, but the value that each of my female colleagues bring to the table. And yes, it can get a little testy at times, if you will, but taking a step back. And I think that's part of the awareness that we talked about. That's part of the training that we have for our staff to not only understand our civility, but also managing our own incivility. And I think when we talk about those shared, those learned behaviors, I think those are the behaviors that our staff replicate. And so I think we as a body need to understand and embrace first those differences and recognize from a collegial respect that there will be differences and be able to work and actively work through those differences.
I would say, the first salvo of incivility often begins with othering. And so I could be othered because I'm female. You could be othered because you're a minority. You could be othered because I'm different from you. And you take that to an extreme. So that's where we begin. The incivility. And so I just acknowledging that you spoke at the very beginning to cultural competency. And I think that kind of runs through this as well. But when we're in the room and the othering is happening, the question really comes back to us. How do we choose to address what we're witnessing as incivility? And this is where the dais becomes very important in a public setting, where acknowledging that something that happened is not acceptable, apologizing to the person who has been othered in a way that is unacceptable, violates your ground rules or your norms. But that kind of brings it back to, how did we decide we want to treat each other? How did we agree we're going to behave? But we can't just sit by silently and be like, I'm glad that wasn't me, and just pick up and make the point we want to make. We have to first acknowledge what's happening in the room and the environment that it's creating for people.
I'm conscious you're over there. Anything you wish to add? I want to make sure you're not left out over there.
Sorry, was that to me? Oh, yeah, I think that's a great point that Julie just made, and that's a tremendous role for elected officials and staff to play, to kind of step in those sorts of situations and point out when that's happening.
Does anyone in the room have a question by chance? Please feel free to raise your hands. I'm gonna. I'd be thinking, because I hope to get one or two from you as you're with us. Yeah, we have one down here. If you wouldn't mind just also introducing yourself.
Elizabeth Partoy, and I'm on the team in the Institute for Youth Education and Families here at NLC. It's wonderful to have you all here. Thank you. I'm wondering, I think about, we were talking about behavior and the idea of shaping behavior, right? And I wonder if there are places or examples, Matt or other people that you know of, where opportunities have been created or arisen and taken advantage of, where reinforcement of good behavior is not only acknowledged, but also then intentionally modeled by people in perceived positions of power. The other thing that's related to that in my mind is, are there ways to build civility, I mean, that's massive, into success indicators, into a qualification for or a requirement for success? How do you make sure that your own behavior is calibrated against these measures of what we know good modeling is and good behavior is yourself? A couple questions.
So I'll take a stab at it. I think the first thing that comes to mind, since you mentioned the work that you do in children, youth, and families. And so within Montgomery County, we have a great system of networking and outreach. In some spaces and some municipalities, they may be known as violence interrupters, but we have our positive youth development. And part of that shape behavior, because they deal with a lot of incivility, if you will, especially among teens. And so that's when you bring in not only those youth, but also their parents. And so education, going back to that education model and that paradigm that you talk about, and looking at that shift in paradigm. So looking at those models, and then looking, not only using those models, but sharing them with individuals as yourself as being best practices or better practices. Because that's one thing that we often don't do. We go back to the notion of my colleagues and I talking about a summit, but a quick win could be just sharing those best practices with other community partners or with the organizations that are associated with this discussion this afternoon, just to say, hey, we have some best practices or better practices that you could use or glean from. So I think that's how we manage some of those shared, those shaped behaviors.
I'll just add briefly, your question made me think about, well, why not build this into qualifications? for applicants for jobs of managing incivility in their environment. And then have these as part of what we ask people about and have them demonstrate their ability as opposed to hiring them on other bases. And then we have to deal with this inconvenience nowadays, because what I'm saying is it's here to stay for a while. And it's a competency that we need to be screening for.
If there's an interest, especially I think about elected officials that I've worked with as governing bodies, where they decide this is how we're going to behave, like these are our ground rules, then the check to that is, do we evaluate ourselves on the behavior? Do we do a check-in? I've had city councils that I've worked with that have actually had a meeting. They evaluated their own behaviors after each meeting. They talked about it at quarterly workshops, kind of how are we doing? Are we where we want to be yet in this journey towards changing what the public forum looks like? So very basic types of tools, but those are things that can be put in place. If you want to measure it as an indicator of success, you can choose to put that in place.
You know, I don't know if this directly answers your question, but something that I do often, which is modeling to second and third grade classes. When I go to the schools, usually it's on National Reading Day, and I go and I read a book, but I also engage beyond the book and just sit there and openly discuss, ask the question, what is civility? And you'd be surprised that these second graders are sitting there coming up and saying exactly what civility really is. And so I'm modeling in that way, and what is the proper way to engage with each other. And then at a larger scale, when in Ohio, and a lot of people are well aware of this, when we had the incident that occurred in Springfield, Ohio, there was a number of mayors from across the state, and it was a bipartisan group, came to Springfield to show support and solidarity. And I think that not only resonated with the mayor, who in a lot of ways was really struggling with what he was having to manage, and the city manager with the 30+ bomb threats that are coming in, and the school disruption and educational disruption, as if the pandemic wasn't enough, that this is adding a whole different dimension, that being there for each other. And it's not just mayors and city council members. I think that us as a society need to have that empathy to sit there when we recognize that something isn't going right in some part of your community. Everyone gathers around and supports and uplifts. That's modeling, in my opinion. You're truly showing humanity for each other in the way in which you're going to protect and support those who we recognize are in some level of crisis.
If I could add to the part about youth, I mean, young people are an absolutely critical asset for improving public life. I mean, they're leaders of tomorrow, so this is educational for them, but they're also can be the leaders of today. And some of the communities we work with find that, when you involve young people in public meetings, the adults also behave better because the young people are modeling virtues and conduct that we all want to see. So that's one important piece. And then the indicators, the performance, the measurement thing is really critical. We can't improve things if we're not measuring them. And one of our problems in this whole realm of public engagement is we don't measure very much. Occasionally we measure how many people are showing up to things, but that's almost the only thing. There's lots of things you can do. We use a simple ratings tool called the Civic Engagement Scorecard, which we've used in those communities I mentioned to measure the conduct and measure the attitudes of people attending the meeting. So people just have a quick way to kind of measure, was the meeting good? Was it civil? How could it have been better? And also to rate their communities in various ways. That gives you some data that you can come back to and figure out as you try new things, do people like them? And do they improve civility? Do they improve other aspects of the meetings? The school superintendent in Mesa, Arizona actually built the scorecard scores into her own performance review for her job. So yes, we can include these sorts of things in meaningful ways to reward people for doing better work to engage the public. So measurement is absolutely critical.
Got a few more minutes here, so I'm going to have another one that was sent in from virtually. And Matt, again, I'm going to start with you because I think you might be able to take a good swing at this one first off. The question says, there is some feeling arising among some public officials that our fields and public sector work is being attacked unfairly and that we should be standing up and pushing back. how would you help individuals note the difference between fighting back and being uncivil? And I guess I would add to that, how do you kind of strike that balance between being civil while also perhaps maybe standing up for yourself and the work that you do?
I think the key to all of that is making sure it's a two-way exchange. If you're simply standing up and saying, this is what we're doing a great job, this is how you should behave in public life. If it's a purely one-way messaging, that's unlikely to work, and it's probably going to produce kind of a pushback from people who you're trying to reach. If it's a two-way sort of a thing, and there's all kinds of ways you can do that, then that's different. Then you're inviting people in. You're giving them more information. You're giving them some sort of meaningful role in decision making and problem solving, and they're likely through that process to know and understand much better the job that you're doing and the difficult choices that people in government face. If you invite them into governance in various sorts of ways that respect their knowledge, their skills, their capacities, then you are giving them a much better sense of the job that you're doing. So always, and I think this is a really critical point, because on this issue, it's quite possible that people, through the best of intentions, can cause a pushback if they seem to be kind of talking down to citizens. If they act as if they are kind of trying to encourage or to require kind of better conduct without creating settings where that conduct can actually come about, then that is where there can be a lot of pushback. You can use your moral authority, absolutely, but also provide settings and skills where people can actually interact with each other, can kind of embody the kind of conduct you want, and can be part of decision making in ways that help them understand much better what governance is really about.
And Chris, I'd like to challenge an implication of your add-on question about the balance between civility and pushing back. I think we can always be civil while pushing back hard. And we need more examples of that. At these summits we're going to do, I would show videotapes of somebody vigorously pushing back, vigorously. Like, this, I think, is unfair to me and my community. I think this is going to be destructive. I'm being vigorous, but I'm not saying, and you want to do it, and you don't care, and you're a bunch of incompetents. So we can always hold ourselves to the civility of respect and treating people with dignity 100% of the time. And when we fail, to evaluate that. And so I really wanted to say this, because the critique of the civility language is you have to be nice. You keep your voice calm. No, you can be vigorous and civil.
So I would like to just say, Bill, you're absolutely right, because I was in a situation with a public official, and the public official was being very incivil, and that incivility really incensed me. And what I did was I paused for a moment, and I specifically and emphatically stated the facts. I think we both arrived and landed on a common ground of civility because it was very measured in the response. And so I wholeheartedly agree with that approach. And maybe we can talk about it in the summit that I know you're going to help plan.
All right. Unfortunately, we are almost out of time. We could do this probably all afternoon, probably all evening, into several days, but we have to send everybody home, and we have other things to do, unfortunately. And so my final question, I want to do this somewhat rapid fire, but we'll see how it goes. I want to work down the line here. Well, somewhat work down the line. What is one takeaway that you want the audience to go away with as they log off or they go back to their respective communities? What's one thing you want them to take away from our conversation? Julia, I want to start with you.
That setting a standard matters, and you can begin where you are and it grows from there. So be the first pebble, be the first ring, and start influencing what you can, and then it will spread, because it really will matter in whatever setting you choose to acknowledge the frustration and disagree vigorously and state the facts and care passionately about the community that you're in.
Matt, I want to come to you next.
We always need to be trying to understand, what it takes for people to feel and be heard. Everybody wants to be heard, whether they're an elected official, staff, resident. They all want to feel heard, and most of them, in many cases, don't feel heard. most of the time. And so that is what leads to frustration, anger, incivility, all these sorts of things. There's an article I put in the chat about what does it take. There's a whole bunch of ways people can feel heard, from kind of being in a small group discussion to seeing what they said somehow represented, to having some sort of official response from government, or a very small unofficial response. There's all kinds of things you can do, but people need to feel heard. And if you create settings where people do feel heard, a few of the people who come to your meetings now will actually never show up again because they've lost a kind of an open mic where they can perform for the, for their friends. A whole lot more people are likely to come in because they do want to feel heard. And some of the people who've been there all along will feel much more valued. So creating situations where people are all, whoever they are feeling heard by others. That's really the key to all of this.
Well,
Upgrade your skills if you're a public official in the public world, because we live in this age and we have to have the skills for the age. I'll put in a pitch. There's a Braver Angels free e-course on managing difficult conversations. And then hold a community conversation, hold a summit on civility to try to create norms for this community about how we're going to conduct ourselves.
Sure. And I would just end by saying, define incivility and civility for yourself. Share that definition with your colleagues and those that you work closely with, and then identify a common space. Establish a shared understanding of both incivility and civility, and then replicate that. It's all about sharing how you define or qualify both of those terms, civility and incivility. And I think we will have one, incivility, to diminish, and increase incivility, but it will take time.
And Mayor Patterson, since you're the president of NLC and we're in your building, why don't you give us the last word?
I would say the last word is NLC is great. And
Yeah, Braver Angels is great too.
it is. So is ICMA. Everyone's good.
Hers great.
APA is great.
APHA.
That's coming from a former health psychologist. I would say, as an elected official, engage with the people, go to where the people are at, listen, actively listen to what is being said, model and reflect back that you are listening, and keep that open, positive demeanor in return. What used to take me a half hour to go grocery shopping now takes an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, but it's because I show up and I do listen and let them know that I am there for them to listen. And so I'd encourage any other elected official, whether it's farmer's market, and that's going to take you 2 hours as well, or going to the grocery store, do it and be consistent with doing that.
Well, that unfortunately is all the time that we have. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. We have a lot of extra resources which you can scan there with the QR code. But thank you all so much for being here, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you so much. That was great. Thank you. It's me. Thank you.